The 30th of April, 1943. The sea off Huelva. On the southwestern coast of Spain. The air is thick with salt and the smell of decomposing matter. A local fisherman, Jose Antonio Rey Maria, strains against his net, his eyes catching something unnatural bobbing in the murky dawn tide. It is not a log, nor the usual flotsam of the war that has so far spared his coast. It is a man, floating face down, his uniform waterlogged and heavy. He is wearing the trench coat of a British Royal Marine officer, and chained to his wrist is a black, official-looking briefcase. The fisherman crosses himself, his mind racing. He has found many things in these waters, but never a thing like this. Within hours, the body is hauled ashore, becoming the immediate and pressing concern of the local Spanish authorities. This single decomposing corpse, seemingly just another tragic statistic of the war at sea, was in fact a meticulously crafted weapon. It was the linchpin of the most sophisticated, audacious, and strategically vital deception in modern history. A lie so profound, it would reroute the entire German war machine, bypass Hitler's intuition, and save tens of thousands of Allied lives. This is the story of how that lie worked, not just by fooling German intelligence, but by exploiting their deepest, most ingrained assumptions about their enemy. The official report filed by Jose Antonio Rey Maria was simple, factual, and devoid of emotion. He noted the time of discovery, 7:15 a.m., and the location, approximately 1 mile off the coast. The body was transferred to the local authorities, where it fell under the jurisdiction of Dr. Eduardo Delgras. The initial autopsy, conducted with the morbid curiosity reserved for an enemy officer, was perplexing. Dr. Price Requels, Tarding, Delgras noted in his preliminary findings that the man appeared to have been in the water for several days, perhaps a week. The cause of death was listed, almost automatically, as drowning consistent with an aviation accident at sea. The body showed signs of prolonged immersion, but, crucially, little external trauma. The man, identified by the papers in his wallet as Major William Martin, Royal Marines, was simply another victim. Yet, certain details were troubling. The state of decomposition seemed slightly advanced for the time frame, but the cold water could explain that. The most significant finding was the absence of any sign of a struggle. He had simply drowned. This banal conclusion was exactly what the planners in London had hoped for, yet it was a conclusion based on an absence of evidence. The Spanish, officially neutral but swarming with German agents, treated the body with the requisite military respect, but their primary interest was the black briefcase. Hundreds of miles away, in the stale, smoke-filled air of Room 13, a cramped basement office in the British Admiralty, the tension was suffocating. For Lieutenant Commander Ewen Montagu, the chief architect of the plan, the weight was agonizing. He and his small team in the 20 Committee, the double-cross system, had done everything humanly possible. They had built a man from nothing, given him a name, a rank, a personality, and even a fictitious fiancé. They had dressed him, equipped him, and launched him into the Atlantic from the submarine HMS Seraph. Now, silence. Montagu later recalled the agonizing suspense in his memoirs. The man who never was. We could only wait. We could not even inquire. Had he been found? Had he come ashore with his precious briefcase still chained to his wrist? Had it been opened? Had the contents been noted? Every possibility was a nightmare. If the body washed out to sea, the entire operation was a waste. If it was found by an Allied sympathizer who simply handed the briefcase, unopened, to the British naval attaché in Huelva, the deception would fail. The worst-case scenario. The Spanish would conduct a truly thorough autopsy, discovering the chemical preservation that hinted the man was dead long before he ever hit the water. The plan rested on a knife edge, balanced between Spanish indifference and German curiosity. The strategic gamble was enormous precisely because Huelva was not some quiet backwater. It was, as Montagu knew, a hornet's nest of espionage. The port was crawling with German Abwehr agents, all operating under the watchful eye of their energetic and highly competent chief in Huelva, Adolf Kloss. Claus was known to have the local Spanish authorities thoroughly penetrated, paying handsomely for any scrap of intelligence, especially shipping manifests, sailors' gossip, or anything washed ashore from the Atlantic convoys. The British were counting on Claus. They were not trying to bypass him. They were aiming directly at him. The entire deception was a piece of bait designed for one specific type of fish. This was the core risk. The plan's success depended entirely on the enemy's efficiency. The British naval attaché in Huelva, Lieutenant Commander Francis Haselden, was instructed to begin frantically demanding the return of the briefcase, citing its high-level diplomatic sensitivity. This diplomatic panic, another layer of the deception, was designed to signal to any watching Spanish or German official that the contents of that case were of monumental importance. The Major Martin package was not just a corpse. It was a carefully staged play, and the curtains were just rising on the coast of Spain. This body, now lying in a Spanish morgue, was the solution to a problem that had baffled Allied High Command for months. It was a weapon created out of desperation, designed to crack open a strategic deadlock that threatened to derail the entire Allied invasion of Europe. To understand why this one man's fabricated life was so critical, one must first understand the impossible strategic question facing Churchill and Eisenhower in the spring of 1943, the Sicilian problem. By the opening months of 1943, the strategic map of the war had been fundamentally redrawn. The Axis tide, which had once seemed irreversible, had been broken. In the east, the German Sixth Army was dying in the frozen hell of Stalingrad. In the west, Operation Torch had succeeded. American and British forces had landed in Morocco and Algeria, catching Rommel's Afrika Korps in a pincer move, with Montgomery's Eighth Army advancing from Egypt. The war in North Africa was effectively over, a resounding Allied victory. This success, however, presented an immediate and contentious strategic question. What next? The two great Western allies were divided. In Washington, Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall was a man of singular focus. He argued, with relentless logic, that all Allied resources must be funneled into one objective: a direct, overwhelming cross-channel invasion of France as soon as possible, preferably in 1943. This, he maintained, was the quickest and only path to Berlin. Winston Churchill, however, viewed the map with a different, more romantic and, perhaps, more cunning eye. He saw Europe not as a fortress to be stormed at its strongest point, but as a body with a soft underbelly. He argued passionately for an indirect approach, striking from the south, through Italy, to knock the weakest Axis partner out of the war, bleed the Wehrmacht dry in a new theater, and open the Mediterranean to Allied shipping. The debate came to a head in January 1943, at the Casablanca Conference. In the smoky rooms of the Anfa Hotel, Roosevelt, Churchill, and their combined chiefs of staff hammered out the next phase of the war. In the end, Churchill's argument, combined with the hard reality that a cross-channel invasion in 1943 was simply not feasible due to a lack of landing craft, won the day. Roosevelt sided with the British. The decision was made. The Allies would strike at the soft underbelly. The first target would be the island of Sicily, under the code name Operation Husky. The strategic logic was undeniable. Sicily was the critical stepping stone. Its capture would sever the Axis supply lines across the Mediterranean, making North Africa permanently secure. More importantly, it would clear the Sicilian Narrows, the vital shipping lane that forced all Allied convoys to take the long, dangerous route around the Cape of Good Hope. As a political objective, an invasion of Sicily, Italian home territory, might be the final shock needed to topple Benito Mussolini's fascist regime and force Italy's surrender. On paper, it was the perfect, logical, and obvious next move. And that was precisely the problem. The target was too obvious. The Germans were not fools. They could read a map just as well as the Allies. They understood the strategic importance of Sicily better than anyone. From their perspective, it was the critical anchor, holding their entire Mediterranean position together. The German High Command, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, and specifically the Commander-in-Chief South, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, fully anticipated an Allied strike at the island. Kesselring, a meticulous and highly capable commander, began reinforcing Sicily with a grim determination. Throughout the spring of 1943, German strength on the island swelled. The formidable 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, elite paratroopers, were moved into place. Most critically, the newly reconstituted and powerful Hermann Göring Panzer Division was transferred from France and Italy to the island, its tanks and armored infantry digging in to counter any amphibious landing. Admiral Karl Donitz, head of the Kriegsmarine, noted in his own war diary the high probability of an invasion, ordering U-boats to patrol the approaches and the Luftwaffe to lay extensive minefields in the surrounding waters. Kesselring's own memoirs, written after the war, confirm this. He stated plainly, "It was clear to me from the first that Sicily, as the key to the Mediterranean and the gateway to Italy, would be the next Allied objective. We expected the main landing in the southeast of the island. The Allies were planning to launch their greatest amphibious operation to date against a fortress that was already watching the gates." This grim reality landed on the desk of Colonel John "Johnny" Bevan, the head of the London Controlling Section, LCS. The LCS was the secretive organization responsible for coordinating all of an Allied strategic deception. Bevan's problem was immense. The Allies could not hide the preparations times for an invasion. The sheer volume of men, ships, landing craft, and aircraft gathering in North African ports like Algiers, Tunis, and Oran would be impossible to conceal from the Abwehr's aerial reconnaissance and network of agents. Since the Allies could not hide the exact times of invasion, they had to falsify its destination asterisk. The 20 Committee, so named for the Roman numeral XX or double cross, which handled the network of turned German agents, was tasked with feeding misinformation. But this required something more. They needed a blockbuster deception, a single brilliant stroke so compelling that it would override all of German strategic logic. They needed a lie that would make the Wehrmacht look times from the most obvious target in the world and stare with conviction at the wrong one. The mandate was clear. Convince Berlin that the target was not Sicily, but Greece and Sardinia. The strategic impasse was total. A direct assault on a prepared and waiting Sicily would be a bloodbath, a Dieppe on a catastrophic scale. But the Germans were logical. They were reinforcing the logical target. To save lives, the Allies had to find a way to make the illogical seem logical. They had to plant evidence so high-level, so secret, that it would force Hitler and the OKW to disbelieve their own field commanders. They needed a piece of information that would not just suggest, but prove that the real targets were in the eastern Mediterranean. The problem was how to deliver this information. It couldn't come from a double agent. It might be seen as a plant. It had to come from a source so pure, so accidental, that the Germans would believe they had discovered it themselves. This desperate need for an unimpeachable channel set the stage for one of the most macabre and brilliant ideas in the history of warfare, an idea born from the mind of a future spy novelist. The problem facing Colonel John Bevan and the London Controlling Section was not a lack of imagination, but a lack of credibility. In the high-stakes game of strategic deception, the opponent assumes you are lying. Any information fed through a known channel, a captured German agent now working as a double-cross for MI5, a leaked diplomatic cable, a carefully planted rumor in a neutral capital, was automatically suspect. The Abwehr was a professional organization. They expected the British to be planting misinformation, especially in the run-up to a major offensive. The challenge, therefore, was not to create a lie asterisk, but to create a channel for that lie that was utterly unimpeachable. They needed the Germans to discover the information through what appeared to be pure, catastrophic, dumb luck. The information had to be found, not given. It had to be a prize the Abwehr believed they had stolen through their own skill and efficiency, a secret plucked from the heart of the British establishment. This need for a novel delivery method sent the planners digging through files of unconventional, even bizarre wartime suggestions, leading them to one of the strangest and most fertile minds in British naval intelligence. That mind belonged to Lieutenant Commander Ian Fleming. In 1943, Fleming was not yet the celebrated creator of James Bond, but he was already a figure of considerable influence and creativity within the secretive walls of the Admiralty's Room 39. He served as the personal assistant to the formidable Director of Naval Intelligence, DNI, Rear Admiral John Godfrey. Godfrey was a brilliant, irascible, and demanding officer, widely believed to be the inspiration for Bond's future boss, M. Fleming, with his background in journalism and finance, was his ideas man, his troubleshooter, and his conduit to the stranger fringes of espionage and special operations. He was tasked with thinking the unthinkable, with proposing schemes that a normal military mind would dismiss as preposterous. Fleming's role was to bridge the gap between naval strategy and sheer unadulterated pulp fiction, and he excelled at it. He was involved in everything from organizing commando units to dreaming up impossible gadgets. It was in this capacity that Fleming, years earlier, had co-authored a document that would prove to be the genesis of the entire operation. This document, known as the Trout Memo, was compiled in 1939, shortly after the war began. It was named not for its author, but for Admiral Sir Frederick Trout, a colleague of Godfrey's known for his expertise in fly fishing. The memo was essentially a list, a brainstorm of 54 audacious, eccentric, and sometimes frankly absurd ideas for deceiving the enemy at sea, comparing the methods of deception to the art of fly fishing. The memo was pure Fleming, creative, ruthless, and with a distinct flair for the dramatic. It included suggestions like planting floating rumors in bottles, creating fake naval minefields out of painted buoys, and other such unorthodox tactics. Most of the ideas were clever, but one, item number 28, stood out for its macabre originality. It was filed under the heading, "A Suggestion." Not a very nice one. Fleming, likely drawing on a 1,930 seconds detective novel called Times, The Milliner's Hat Mystery **, wrote, "A body, dressed as an airman, with dispatches in his pockets, could be dropped on the coast, supposedly from a parachute which has failed. I understand there is no difficulty in obtaining bodies at the naval hospitals." This chillingly practical and utterly ghoulish idea was, at the time, just one more piece of creative thinking, and it was filed away by Godfrey. The idea lay dormant for years until 1942, when the strategic need for deception became paramount. Independently of Fleming, a young flight lieutenant in MI5 Section B-1A, Charles Cholmondeley, pronounced Chumley, conceived a remarkably similar plan. Cholmondeley was part of the 20 Committee, and was wrestling with the same problem as the LCS: how to deliver fake documents to the Germans. His idea, which he codenamed Trojan Horse, was to place fake documents on a dead man and have him wash ashore from a downed aircraft. Cholmondeley's plan, however, immediately hit a practical and gruesome roadblock: forensics. He consulted with the renowned Home Office pathologist Sir Bernard Spilsbury, who delivered a stark warning. It would be nearly impossible to find a fresh body and make its cause of death convincingly appear to be from an air crash or drowning. Any competent medical examiner would likely spot the deception. A man who died from, say, pneumonia in a London hospital would have water in his lungs, but it would be fresh water, not salt water, and the other physiological signs would be all wrong. The plan stalled, deemed too complex, and too likely to fail under scrutiny. It was at this point that someone in the intelligence community, possibly Fleming's old boss Godfrey, connected Cholmondeley's stalled plan with the old Trout Memo. The two concepts were merged. Cholmondeley, the practical MI5 man, was introduced to the concept from Fleming, the naval intelligence ideas man. The concept was dusted off, no longer a piece of pulp fiction but a desperate operational possibility. The critical difference was that Fleming's original idea was simpler: a body from a failed parachute, not a complex air crash. This was refined. What if the man died at sea, not in the air? What if the cause of death was simply drowning? The forensic challenges were still immense, but the core idea was now deemed viable enough to present to the men who could actually make it happen. The plan, now officially resurrected, was passed from the realm of creative theory to the world of grim practice. It was handed to Ewen Montagu, a brilliant lawyer in civilian life, and a key member of the 20 Committee specializing in the legal and logistical side of deception. It would be Montagu's job, working alongside Cholmondeley, to take this macabre fantasy and turn it into a meticulously engineered, forensically sound, and strategically decisive reality. The operation, codenamed Mincemeat, was now the formal responsibility of the 20 Committee. This innocuous name, derived from the Roman numeral XX for double cross, masked what was arguably the most potent and sophisticated weapon in the British intelligence arsenal. The committee's function was unprecedented. It was not mere counter-espionage, which simply catches and neutralizes enemy spies. The 20 Committee *controlled times espionage. By 1943, operating under the brilliant leadership of Sir John Masterman, MI5 had successfully captured or turned nearly every German agent sent to Britain. These agents, now working for the British, were used as a controlled pipeline, a direct feed of curated poison into the heart of the Abwehr. The committee was a small, eclectic group of academics, lawyers, and military men who specialized in the high art of strategic deception. They were the perfect body to take Ian Fleming's macabre fantasy and Charles Cholmondeley's Trojan horse and execute it with the precision of a legal argument. The man who took charge of the operational file was Lieutenant Commander Ewen Montagu. Montagu was, in many ways, the perfect man for the job. In civilian life, he was a brilliant and highly successful King's Counsel, a top-tier lawyer known for his meticulous preparation and his ability to construct an unassailable case. His mind was not that of a soldier, but of an advocate. He approached Operation Mincemeat not as a military gamble, but as a legal brief he would have to argue before the most skeptical court imaginable, the German High Command. As he detailed in his post-war memoir, the man who never was *, every single detail had to withstand hostile cross-examination. Montagu understood that the deception's success hinged not on the grand lie, but on the flawless consistency of 1,000 tiny interlocking truths. He was obsessed with detail, with the kind of irrefutable evidence that builds a case. He wasn't just inventing a story, he was building a watertight alibi for a man who never existed. His legal training was the perfect antidote to the flights of fancy that so often plagued intelligence work. Working as Montagu's partner was the man who had independently conceived the idea, Flight Lieutenant Charles Cholmondeley. If Montagu was the operation's legal architect, Cholmondeley was its practical engineer. An eccentric and inventive MI5 officer, Cholmondeley was the tinkerer who had to solve the grim physical problems that Montagu's legal mind defined. While Montagu worried about the times content times of the forged letters, Cholmondeley wrestled with the times physics times of the delivery. How to ensure the body would float? How to attach the briefcase so it wouldn't be torn away by the ocean's currents or the submarine's wake. He experimented with life vests, eventually settling on a standard Royal Air Force May West. But even this presented problems. A body that had been dead for days would be full of gas. It might float too high, looking unnatural. Cholmondeley was the one who had to source the period-correct trench coat, the boots, and all the accoutrements of a Royal Marine officer. He was the quartermaster for a phantom soldier, and his meticulous, hands-on approach ensured that the physical presentation of Major Martin would be as flawless as his fabricated backstory. The pair's first and most critical hurdle was forensics. This was the one area where the plan could catastrophically fail before it even began. If the Germans, or even the neutral Spanish, performed a competent autopsy, they might discover the man had not died in an air crash at sea. They might find he had died of, say, cancer, and that his lungs were dry. The deception would be blown instantly. Montagu and Cholmondeley sought the counsel of the most famous and respected pathologist in the world, Sir Bernard Spilsbury. Spilsbury was a legend, a Home Office expert whose testimony in murder trials was considered infallible. Montagu presented the hypothetical problem to him. As Montagu recalled, Spilsbury listened patiently, his face impassive, and then delivered the grim, matter-of-fact verdict that became the cornerstone of the entire operation. First, he stated, The body must be that of a man who died of pneumonia. Pneumonia fills the lungs with fluid, a condition that a Spanish doctor, especially one performing a cursory autopsy, could easily mistake for the effects of drowning. Second, the man must not have died from external injuries, as that would contradict the drowning narrative. Third, and most crucially, the body must be obtained quickly after death and kept in cold storage at a precise temperature around 4 degrees Celsius. This would slow, but not stop, decomposition, making it consistent with a body that had been floating in the cold Atlantic for several days. Spilsbury's clinical advice was the key. He had given them a precise, grim shopping list. The team was now assembled. They had the legalistic and strategic mind of Montagu to build the case for Major Martin's existence. They had the practical, inventive mind of Cholmondeley to handle the complex and morbid logistics. And they had the infallible forensic guidance of Sir Bernard Spilsbury to ensure the lie would survive medical scrutiny. The theory was sound, the plan was approved, and the strategic need was desperate. Now, all they had to do was find him. They needed to find a man who had died of pneumonia, who had no family to claim him, and whose identity could be erased from history so that a new, fictitious one could be built in its place. They had to go, in the most literal sense, grave robbing. The architects now faced their most grotesque and sensitive challenge, procuring the guest of honor. Sir Bernard Spilsbury had provided a precise, non-negotiable specification. They needed a male body, recently deceased, with no major external trauma, and with lungs full of fluid consistent with pneumonia. Just as critically, they needed a body that would not be missed. There could be no grieving family asking questions, no relatives demanding to see the grave, no legal inquiries into the cause of death. Montagu and Cholmondeley began their grim search, and quickly discovered the immense difficulty of their task. London in 1943, even with the Blitz, was not a city overflowing with unclaimed bodies that fit this perfect forensic profile. They made discreet inquiries at naval hospitals, but the bodies of sailors and airmen were almost always claimed by family or, at the very least, accounted for by the military. They were searching for a ghost, a man who had passed through life so anonymously that his disappearance from the public record would go entirely unnoticed. The quest was a moral and logistical nightmare, and it was stalling the entire operation. The breakthrough came not from the military, but from the civilian world, through one of the great unsung heroes of Operation Mincemeat. This was Mr. Dade and War, Bentley Purchase, the coroner for the Northern District of London, based at Street Pancras. Purchase was a man who, by the very nature of his job, had legal jurisdiction over the unclaimed dead of his district. He was a practical, discreet, and patriotic man, and Montagu decided to approach him, gambling that he would understand the gravity of the situation. In his memoir, Montagu describes the clandestine and deeply awkward meeting. He could not, of course, tell Purchase the details of a top-secret strategic deception. Instead, he had to rely on veiled language and appeals to authority. He explained that he needed a body for a purpose of the utmost operational importance, a purpose he could not disclose but which could save thousands of lives. He was asking Purchase to break numerous regulations, to commit a body to an unknown fate, and to do so purely on the word of a naval intelligence officer. It was an enormous personal and professional risk for the coroner. If the plan were ever exposed, Purchase would be ruined, accused of trafficking in the dead. After a long, tense silence, Purchase, with what Montagu described as quiet patriotism, simply agreed to help. He would keep an eye out. A few weeks later, Purchase made the call. A candidate had arrived at the Street Pancras mortuary. The man was Glyndwr Michael, 34 years old. He was a Welshman, a drifter who had left his home in Aberbargoed years before. He was homeless, friendless, and had been living on the streets of London. On the 28th of January 1943, he had been found in an abandoned warehouse, critically ill. He was taken to Street Pancras Hospital, where he died shortly after. The cause of death was officially listed as phosphorus poisoning. Michael, destitute and starving, had eaten bread scraps laced with rat poison. This personal tragedy, however, was the key to Mincemeat's success. As Bentley Purchase explained, the phosphorus in the poison had the secondary, but critical, effect of causing severe chemical pneumonitis. This was a massive inflammation and fluid buildup in the lungs. Forensically, it was a perfect match for Spilsbury's requirement. It was, as Montagu grimly noted, as good as pneumonia. Here was a man who had died with no external injuries, whose lungs were full of fluid, and whose life was utterly anonymous. His parents were believed to be dead, and he had no known next of kin. Glyndwr Michael was the perfect, tragic candidate. With the candidate identified, Montagu's legal mind went into overdrive to navigate the ethical and legal labyrinth. They could not simply take the body. Even for an unclaimed man, there was a legal requirement to search for relatives. Montagu knew that any such search was a potential security leak. If a distant cousin was found, or if a local Welsh newspaper ran a notice, the entire operation could be compromised. Instead, Montagu and Purchase engaged in a piece of brilliant, necessary fabrication. They created a fiction for the official records. Montagu formally requested the body, claiming it was for secret medical research. Purchase, in his official capacity, agreed to release the body, citing the authority of the Official Secrets Act to waive the requirement for a further search for next of kin. The transaction was buried in paperwork. Montagu promised Purchase that the man would be treated with respect, and that after his service was complete, his body would be given a proper, albeit secret, military burial. With the legal hurdles cleared, Glyndwr Michael's body was secretly transported from the Street Pancras mortuary and placed inside a special canister packed with dry ice. He was taken to a secure cold storage facility at the Hackney Ice and Cold Storage Company. He was now, officially, the property of the Admiralty. The most difficult and macabre component of the operation was secure. Glyndwr Michael, a man whose life had been one of poverty and invisibility, a man who had died a lonely, agonizing death, was about to become the single most important man in the Allied war effort. He was the blank canvas. His anonymity was the shield that would protect the entire operation. His tragic death was the forensic key that would unlock the deception. Now, lying in the frozen darkness of a Hackney warehouse, he awaited his new identity. It was time for Ewen Montagu and Charles Cholmondeley to begin the work of creation, to paint their masterpiece of a life onto this tragic, anonymous clay. They had to transform Glyndwr Michael, the Welsh drifter, into Major William Martin, the Royal Marine. Glyndwr Michael's body was the canvas, but a blank canvas would be immediately suspicious. The task now was to paint a life onto it, a life so detailed, so mundane, and so emotionally resonant that it would be utterly convincing. This was the genius of what intelligence operatives call pocket litter. Ewen Montagu, with his lawyer's mind, knew that a case is won on the small, corroborating details, not just the grand statement. The Abwehr's intelligence analysts were not fools. They were trained to spot fabrications. A sterile body carrying only a secret letter would be an obvious plant. But a man with a fiancée, with money troubles, with an overbearing father, and with the mundane detritus of a real life in his pockets, that was a different matter. The pocket litter was designed to create a person, a legend in spy-com, so that the man who found the documents would first find the man. If they believed in the man, they would believe in the documents. The emotional anchor of this fabrication, the detail designed to humanize Major Martin and make him relatable, was his love life. Montagu and his team decided that Martin must have a fiancée. They named her Pam. This was not just a name. She was given a tangible presence. First came the photograph. Montagu asked the female clerks in his office if anyone had a suitable photo. A young MI5 clerk named Jean Leslie provided a picture of herself in a bathing suit. It was perfect, pretty, but personal. The kind of snapshot a young officer would carry on deployment. Next came the letters. These were the most delicate part of the fabrication. They couldn't be dry or formal. They had to burn with the repressed passion and mundane chatter of a wartime romance. They were penned by a skilled MI5 secretary, Hester Leggett. She wrote 2 letters from Pam, one dated April 14th, and a later one on April 22nd. The letters were a masterpiece of subtle characterization. They mixed terms of endearment. "Oh, darling, why did you have to get that commission?" With complaints about wartime London, chatter about friends, and a hint of a recent, minor lovers' quarrel, a detail of pure genius that made the relationship feel real and imperfect. To complete the picture, the team added a bill from a Bond Street jeweler, S&J.H. Hancock's, dated April 19th, for a diamond engagement ring. The bill was marked as unpaid. This single item told a whole story. He had just bought the ring, perhaps after their little quarrel, and hadn't even had time to pay for it before leaving on his fatal mission. With the emotional core established, Montagu's team built his professional and personal identity. He needed an official identity card. This presented a problem. A standard-issue ID card for a Royal Marine officer would have a photograph, and the team could not photograph the decomposing face of Glyndwr Michael. Instead, they performed a brilliant piece of bureaucratic sleight of hand. They created an official replacement ID card, the kind issued when an officer has lost their original. This new card, Naval Identity Card number 148228, looked fresh and new, which was perfectly explained by its replacement status. Crucially, these temporary cards did not always carry a photograph. To build his backstory, they added a letter from his father. This letter, also fabricated, was written in a stern, slightly old-fashioned hand. It took a disapproving tone, questioning the wisdom of his choice of fiancée and making barbed comments about his finances. This wasn't just color. It served a strategic purpose. It helped explain why Martin might be carrying sensitive letters on his person. A man with a complicated family life and a head full of romantic and financial worries might be precisely the kind of man who would be careless, who might stuff a secret envelope into his briefcase rather than following proper security protocol and destroying it. The masterstroke of this financial and personal carelessness was a letter from Lloyd's Bank. Montagu's team drafted a stern letter from Mr. E.A.W. Archbold, the manager of the bank's Oxford Street branch. The letter, dated April 14th, was addressed to Major Martin, informing him that his account was overdrawn in the sum of £79, 19 seconds 2d, and politely but firmly requesting his immediate attention to the matter. This was perhaps the most brilliant piece of pocket litter in the entire collection. It was profoundly, painfully real. What young officer at war times wasn't times in some kind of financial disarray? This letter accomplished three things simultaneously. First, it reinforced his identity as a real person with mundane problems. Second, it amplified the careless trait, suggesting a man distracted by personal issues. Third, and most psychologically astute, it provided a subtle, subconscious link to the official letters he was carrying. A man who is careless with his personal finances, the German analyst might conclude, is likely to be careless with his official duties. To round out the portrait, a street. Christopher's medal was added to his effects, a small touch of personal faith that an analyst would note. Finally, the team added the mundane details that rooted him in a specific time and place. These were items that proved he was a real person moving through London, not a character created in a lab. They included 2 ticket stubs from a recent performance of the play Strike a New Note at the Prince of Wales Theatre. They added a bill from the Naval and Military Club in Piccadilly, showing a stay of several nights, ending on April 24th, just before his supposed flight. There was an overdue membership card for a London nightclub, and a book of matches from the same club. Each item was a breadcrumb, a tiny, verifiable piece of data that would allow the Abwehr to, as they surely would, cross-reference his movements. They could check the theater listings. They could confirm the club existed. Every item that checked out would build their confidence in the authenticity of the whole. The man was now complete. He was no longer the anonymous Glyndwr Michael. He was Major William Martin, Royal Marines, a man with a loving fiancée, a disapproving father, a very real bank overdraft, and a recent night out on the town. He was flawed, believable, and, above all, real. He was now the perfect, unsuspecting courier for the most important document of the war. With Major William Martin now a fully formed, tragically believable human being, it was time to provide his reason for existing. He needed his payload. The pocket litter was the packaging, but the forged documents inside his briefcase were the warhead. These documents had to be a masterpiece of deception, calibrated with surgical precision. They had to be high-level enough to be taken as gospel by German high command, yet not so high level that their presence on a mere major would be instantly suspicious. For example, a personal letter from Churchill or Roosevelt would be an obvious plant. Such a document would never be hand-carried in this manner. The architects had to select authors who were plausible, senior officers who were privy to strategic planning but not household names, whose signatures would not be instantly recognizable to a German forgery expert. This led them to Lieutenant General Sir Archibald Nye, the Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, VCIGS. The choice of Nye was a masterstroke of bureaucratic genius. As the Vice Chief, he was second in command of the entire British Army, a man who would absolutely be involved in high-level strategic planning. However, he was not a superstar field commander like Montgomery or Alexander. His role was primarily administrative and logistical, making it plausible that he would be corresponding about the details of upcoming operations. The document was meticulously forged on official War Office stationery. It was framed not as a formal strategic order, but as a personal, handwritten letter from Nye to General Sir Harold Alexander, the Allied commander in North Africa. This personal framing was another critical psychological trick. It explained why the letter was being hand-carried, a personal note between generals, rather than sent via encrypted cable. It also allowed Nye to carelessly mix official business with personal asides, making the entire document feel more authentic and human. The letter was designed to be a gossip letter between old colleagues, a format that made the inclusion of top-secret details seem like a moment of British aristocratic indiscretion. The content of the lie was the core of the entire operation. The Nye letter, dated April 23rd, opened with some casual remarks before getting to the business. It explicitly discussed the upcoming Allied plans for the Mediterranean. Nye's letter confirmed that the Allies were planning two major offensives. The primary invasion, codenamed Operation Brimstone, would be aimed at Greece, striking the Kalamata and Patras coastlines. A secondary simultaneous operation, codenamed Operation Führer, would be launched against the island of Sardinia. But the true genius of the letter lay in how it handled the Sicilian problem. The letter Times mentioned Sicily. It did so in a dismissive, almost offhand way. Nye informed Alexander that the Allies were using Sicily as the target for a massive deception operation, a feint designed to draw German reserves times from the real target, Greece. This was the psychological masterstroke. The Germans already believed Sicily was the target. This letter confirmed their belief, but brilliantly reframed it. It told the Germans, "You are not wrong. You are just being cleverly fooled. You have correctly identified our Times cover story asterisk." It flattered their intelligence by letting them in on a deeper secret, making them believe they were outsmarting the Allies who were trying to fool them. To add an extra layer of accidental corroboration, Montagu's team added a second forged letter to the briefcase. This one was from Lord Louis Mountbatten, the dashing and well-connected Chief of Combined Operations, to Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham, the Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet. This letter was deliberately different in tone. While the Nye letter was formal but personal, Mountbatten's was chatty, informal, and full of the breezy arrogance of a high-born naval officer. It was full of naval jargon and shop talk. Crucially, in the midst of a paragraph about a new type of landing craft, Mountbatten carelessly inserted a joke. He mentioned that Major Martin was on his way to Alexander's headquarters and was carrying a letter about the upcoming operations, and that Martin was also a specialist on the new craft. Then Mountbatten wrote, "Let me know what you think of the sardines. We'll have to get the Greeks to take on the tunny." It was a clumsy, almost juvenile attempt at a pun, a clear wink at the invasion of Sardinia asterisk. This informality was the key. It felt utterly authentic, the kind of privileged inside joke a man like Mountbatten would make. It reinforced the Sardinia lie, and its presence alongside the Nye letter made the entire package feel less like a sterile, official plant, and more like a messy, accidental capture of genuine correspondence. The documents were now complete. They were works of art, forged with the correct ink, on the correct paper, and signed with passable imitations of the officers' signatures. They were folded and placed, along with the love letters, the bank overdraft, and the theater tickets, into Major Martin's black briefcase. The briefcase itself was a standard-issue military item, but it too was given a layer of authenticity. It was slightly worn, as if from regular use. The courier and his message were now one. Major Martin's fabricated life, his debts, his fiancée, his careless nature all provided the perfect, plausible context for his carrying these monumentally important letters. The entire package was a self-sustaining ecosystem of lies, where every detail reinforced every other detail. The final, irreversible step was next. The body of Glyndwr Michael, now Major William Martin, was taken from his cold storage drawer. It was time to deliver the package to the enemy. The operation now entered its final, irreversible phase. The body of Glyndwr Michael, now fully dressed in the uniform of a Royal Marine Major, was taken from the Hackney cold storage facility. His trench coat was buttoned, his Mae West life vest was fitted, and the all-important briefcase was chained securely to his wrist. The body was placed into a specially constructed steel canister, 6 feet 8 inches long, with the label, "Handle with care, optical instruments." The canister was sealed and filled with dry ice, to maintain preservation during the journey. This final phase of the operation was given its own code name, a deliberate piece of internal misdirection. Operation Husky. This was the same code name as the real invasion of Sicily, a confusing overlap designed to ensure that even if the name leaked, it would be mistaken for planning related to the main invasion. On the 19th of April, 1943, the canister was loaded into an unremarkable van and driven from London by Charles Cholmondeley and Ewen Montagu to the submarine base at Holy Loch, Scotland. The delivery vehicle was His Majesty's Submarine times Seraph *, a fast and modern S-class submarine. Her commander was a young, 9-year-old officer, Lieutenant Norman Bill Jewell. Jewell was one of the very few men outside the Corps 20 committee team to be read into the truth of the operation. Montagu, who had known Jewell personally, briefed him in person. The secrecy was absolute. As Jewell later recounted, he was told the bare, shocking essentials. He was to transport a dead body, disguised as secret cargo, and release it off the coast of Spain. Montagu showed Jewell the fake photograph of Major Martin. The one of Jean Leslie, his fiancée, was not used, but a separate, fabricated ID photo was created for this briefing, so that Jewell could identify him, a grim piece of theater. Jewell's crew, however, was told a different story. They were informed that the canister, which was loaded onto the submarine and secured on the fore casing just behind the torpedo tubes, contained a top-secret meteorological device to be deployed off the Spanish coast. The crew's curiosity was palpable, but military discipline held. The journey of the times, Seraph times, was one of agonizing tension. The submarine set off from Holy Loch on April 19th, beginning a perilous 10-day voyage. They had to travel submerged for much of the way, navigating the heavily patrolled Bay of Biscay and the dangerous Straits of Gibraltar, both swarming with German U-boats, destroyers, and maritime patrol aircraft. Lieutenant Jewell was under almost unbearable pressure. He was carrying the single most sensitive secret of the war. If the Times Seraph Times was depth-charged, damaged, and forced to surface, he had standing orders. The canister and all related materials were to be destroyed at all costs, and the crew was to go down with the ship rather than risk capture. For 10 days, the crew went about their duties, nervously eyeing the strange canister that was, as Jewell knew, the tomb of a man who never was. The morbid curiosity, the whispered jokes about what Churchill's secret weapon might be, all added to the psychological strain on the young commander. Finally, in the pre-dawn darkness of the 30th of April 1943, the Times Seraph Times reached its designated position, approximately 1 mile off the coast of Huelva, near the mouth of the Tinto River. At 4:30 a.m., Jewel gave the order to surface. The night was moonless and still. Only Jewel and his most trusted officers were allowed on the casing. The crew below was ordered to remain at their stations. As the officers struggled with the canister's heavy bolts, Jewel conducted a grim, pre-planned piece of pocket litter insertion. He pulled out the photograph of Pam, Jean Leslie, that was meant to be on Martin's body. In a moment of panic, he realized it had never been placed in the uniform. As Montagu later recounted, this was a critical oversight. Jewel, improvising, decided he couldn't put it on the body now. Instead, he let it fall into the sea, hoping it might wash up separately, a decision that ultimately had no bearing on the operation, but highlighted the immense pressure of the moment. The officers finally opened the canister, releasing a cloud of vapor from the dry ice. They wrestled the stiff body out, checked that the briefcase was secure, and inflated the Mae West life vest. Then, gently, they slid Major Martin into the dark, cold Atlantic water. As the body began to drift away on the morning tide, heading directly for the shore as planned, Lieutenant Jewel, a devout man, leaned over the casing and recited the 39th Psalm. I will keep my mouth as it were with a bridle, while the ungodly is in my sight. The submarine's engines engaged, the Seraph submerged, and slipped away into the darkness, its mission complete. The package was delivered. The bait, now bobbing in the tide, was in the water. The British part of the operation was over. Ewen Montagu and Charles Cholmondeley, back in London, could only wait. Their careers and the lives of thousands of men now entirely dependent on the actions of a Spanish fisherman, the curiosity of a local German agent, and the assumptions of the German High Command. The success of the operation was no longer in their hands. As depicted in the opening, the body of Major Martin was found by José Antonio Rey Maria and hauled ashore at Huelva. It was immediately taken into custody by the local Spanish naval authorities, who, in accordance with diplomatic protocol, notified the British vice-consul in the city. That vice-consul was, in reality, a dedicated and highly trusted MI6 agent named Francis Haselden. The moment Haselden received the call, the next phase of the operation, the diplomatic performance, began. Haselden had been briefed by Montagu. He was to act not as a discreet intelligence officer, but as a panicked, fussy, and over-the-top diplomat, terrified of a security breach. He immediately drove to the Spanish commandancia, demanding to see the body and, far more importantly, the black briefcase. He was informed, with polite Spanish regret, that the briefcase was being held by the local naval judge, as was procedure in such matters. This was the opening move of the Spanish gambit. Haselden, playing his part to perfection, flew into a state of manufactured panic. He began sending a flurry of frantic, uncoded, or low-grade coded diplomatic cables to the British naval attaché in Madrid, Captain Alan Hilgarth. The cables, which Haselden knew the Germans were intercepting, were a masterpiece of calculated indiscretion. He demanded the immediate retrieval of the briefcase, citing its extreme diplomatic sensitivity. He stressed that it must be recovered unopened and that its contents were of vital importance to Anglo-Spanish relations. This flurry of diplomatic traffic was the equivalent of pouring chum into shark-infested waters. To any German intelligence officer reading the intercepts, Haselden's panic was a blaring siren, signaling that this was no ordinary officer. This was a find of monumental, perhaps war-changing importance. The British were terrified of what was in that case. The primary shark in these waters was Major Adolf Claus. Claus was the head of the local Abwehr station in Huelva, an energetic, competent, and deeply embedded German intelligence officer. He operated under the perfectly mundane cover of an agricultural technician attached to the German consulate, supposedly managing Spanish exports of oranges and wine. In reality, he ran a sprawling and highly effective network of paid informants, with sources inside the Spanish police, the local military, and the docks. The moment Major Martin's body was brought ashore, Claus's network lit up. He was informed within the hour of the discovery of a British officer the attached briefcase, and, most critically, the subsequent and immediate panic of the British vice-consul. Claus, a professional, knew exactly what this combination of facts meant. A potential intelligence coup of the highest order. He immediately activated his most powerful contacts within the Spanish hierarchy. This is where the operation pivoted from a British gamble to a Spanish conspiracy. Franco's Spain, while officially neutral, was ideologically and logistically sympathetic to the Axis cause. The Spanish military and police were deeply conservative, anti-communist, and held a quiet admiration for the German Wehrmacht. Claus did not have to try hard. He made contact with his assets in the Spanish military command, who politely delayed Haselden's official request. They cited the need for a full autopsy, for paperwork to be filed, for reports to be sent to Madrid. While Haselden was being stalled at the front door with bureaucratic excuses, Claus was being led in the back. The Spanish authorities, likely under orders from Colonel Ramon Pardo in Madrid, who was deeply in the pocket of the Abwehr, secretly gave Claus's team access to the body and, more importantly, the briefcase. The Spanish autopsy was conducted, and as Spilsbury and Montagu had gambled, the local doctor, Dr. Eduardo Delgras, concluded the obvious: death by drowning. The fluid in the lungs matched his expectations. The forensic trap had been successfully sprung. Now, with the body processed, the Abwehr team got to work on the briefcase. They were not brutes, they were experts. They did not smash the lock. They carefully, meticulously, and with chemical precision, steamed open the top-secret envelopes from the War Office. They unsealed the personal letters. Their photographers then got to work, meticulously photographing every single page of every single document. They photographed the cold, formal language of the Nye letter, with its bombshell revelations of Operation Brimstone against Greece and Operation Forfar against Sardinia. They photographed the casual, arrogant Mountbatten letter, with its insider joke about sardines. And, just as Montagu had hoped, they photographed times everything times else. They photographed Pam's passionate love letters. They photographed the bank's overdraft notice. They photographed the theater ticket stubs. They were not just stealing a plan, they were performing an intelligence autopsy on a man's entire life. This, to them, was proof. No one would fabricate a lie with this much embarrassing, human and mundane detail. The bait was not just taken, it was swallowed whole, analyzed, and savored. After everything was recorded, the documents were expertly refolded, reinserted into their original envelopes, and resealed. The briefcase was then formally and regrettably handed over to Francis Haselden by the Spanish authorities, with apologies for the unfortunate bureaucratic delay. Haselden, in turn, cabled London that the briefcase had been recovered, and that, based on his external inspection, it appeared to be untampered with. The lie was now officially German intelligence, rock-solid fact, being hand-delivered by Claus's courier on its way to Berlin. The photographs taken by Adolf Claus's team in Huelva were not just a smoking gun, they were a holy grail. The package of intelligence was immediately dispatched from Huelva to the senior Abwehr command in Madrid, landing on the desk of Major Karl Erich Kuhlenthal, the head of German intelligence in Spain. Kuhlenthal was a seasoned, professional, and deeply cynical intelligence chief. He had seen countless attempts at deception, read hundreds of reports from unreliable agents, and was trained to find the flaw in any story. But this was different. He examined the photographs of the documents, the reports from Claus, the intercepts of the panicked British diplomatic cables, and the meticulous translation of Pam's love letters and the bank overdraft. The excitement in the Madrid station was electric. This was not a rumor from a paid informant. This was not a cryptic radio intercept. This was a Category A windfall. A pristine, high-level intelligence coup delivered by pure chance. The reason the Abwehr believed the lie so implicitly, as post-war interrogations and analysis of their records revealed, was a masterpiece of reverse psychology. The source was perfect, precisely because it was not one of their trusted sources. The 20 Committee in London Times controlled all of Germany's agents in Britain, but the Abwehr didn't fully realize the extent of this control. However, They were still professional enough to apply a discount rate to information coming from those agents, suspecting some might be turned. But Major Martin was not an agent. He was an accident. The information was not fed to them. It was stolen by their own magnificent efficiency. Adolf Kloss's network in Huelva had times beaten times the British. This sense of professional pride, of having outsmarted their opponents, blinded them to the possibility that they were being played. The pocket litter was the psychological key. Kuhlenthal's analysts read Pam's letters and the bank overdraft, and concluded, as Montagu had gambled, that no intelligence service, not even the famously eccentric British, would fabricate a man with such specific, embarrassing, and human flaws. The carelessness of the man, evidenced by his personal life, provided the perfect rationale for his carelessness with the documents. Finally, Hasselden's panicked cables, which the German Funkabwehr radio interception service, had dutifully plucked from the airwaves, provided the final, screaming confirmation. The British were desperate to get the case back. This, to the Abwehr, was irrefutable proof of its value. The intelligence was deemed so critical, so authentic, that it bypassed the normal, slower channels. Kuhlenthal in Madrid immediately passed it on to Baron von Boyne, the German military attaché. Von Boyne, vouching for its absolute authenticity, encoded the full text of the Nye and Mountbatten letters and cabled them directly to Berlin, to the very top of the German High Command, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW. The physical photographs were sent by courier on the next diplomatic flight. The intelligence landed in the FHO, or Fremde Heeres, Foreign Armies East. The powerful intelligence analysis branch of the OKW. Here, it was no longer just a find. It was a strategic data point. And it was here that the lie achieved its final, brilliant apotheosis. Inside the FHO, the Major Martin documents did not land in a vacuum. For months, the Allies had been running a much broader, parallel deception campaign called Operation Barclay. Barclay was a white noise operation, a massive campaign of fake radio traffic, phantom army movements, diplomatic rumors, and small-scale commando raids, all designed to suggest a future invasion of the Eastern Mediterranean. Barclay was a collection of thousands of small, circumstantial clues, a rumor in Turkey, a demand for Greek maps in Egypt, a double agent reporting on troop movements. But it lacked a centerpiece. It had no smoking gun. Now, suddenly, the Martin documents arrived. They were the Rosetta Stone that made sense of all the other noise. The FHO analysts, in a moment of profound intellectual satisfaction, connected the dots. All the vague rumors about Greece were true. The Major Martin letters were the high-level, rock-solid proof. The lie had achieved perfect corroboration, using other, smaller lies to sustain it. The process of laundering the lie was complete. It was no longer a British fabrication born in a cramped Admiralty basement. It was now a verified piece of German intelligence, vouched for by the Abwehr in Huelva, certified by the embassy in Madrid, and most importantly, confirmed by the analytical models of the FHO in Berlin. It had been stamped, filed, and validated by the German war machine's own bureaucracy. It was a fact. And as a fact, it was now ready to be presented to the one man whose opinion mattered more than all the intelligence agencies combined. The one man whose intuition was legend, and whose strategic conviction could move armies. The lie was on its way to the Wolf's Lair, to the desk of Adolf Hitler. The laundered, certified intelligence from Major Martin now made its final and most important journey. It traveled from the FHO analysts in Berlin to the damp, fortified concrete of the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. By this stage of the war, Adolf Hitler was increasingly isolated, not just physically, but intellectually. He had grown to deeply distrust the defeatist and unimaginative advice of his own general staff, the aristocratic officers of the Wehrmacht whom he suspected of cowardice or even treachery. He was, by contrast, a true believer in his own messianic intuition, and, critically, in secret intelligence coups that seemed to confirm that intuition. The Major Martin documents were, In this sense, the perfect intelligence for Hitler. They had not come from his generals. They had been stolen by his spies. And they told a story of Allied intentions that was complex, clever, and, to his mind, far more plausible than the obvious. Brutish assault on Sicily his generals feared. We know Hitler's exact reaction because it was meticulously recorded. The official, verbatim transcripts of the Times Führer conferences on naval affairs times provide a stunning, word-for-word account of the lie's ultimate success. On the 14th of May 1943, Hitler held a high-level conference with Admiral Donitz and his senior staff. The minutes of that meeting are chilling in their clarity. Hitler, discussing the defense of the Mediterranean, explicitly references the Major Martin Papers, which he refers to as the discoveries off Huelva. He is not skeptical. He is entirely, unshakably convinced. He states to his admirals that the documents are conclusive and absolutely genuine. He explains that any doubts about their authenticity are unfounded. He then proceeds to recite the core of Montagu's lie, as if it were his own strategic analysis. He declares that the main Allied landings will, without question, be in the eastern Mediterranean, in Greece, specifically the Peloponnese, and on Sardinia. He dismisses the obvious, massive Allied buildup opposite Sicily as the exact cover story the documents had revealed it to be. In a single moment, Ewen Montagu's fabricated thesis, written in a London basement, had become Adolf Hitler's personal, strategic conviction. The psychological brilliance of the deception was proven by Hitler's reaction to the one man who was not fooled. Benito Mussolini, the Italian Duce, was in a state of panic. His own intelligence services, the Times Servizio Informazioni Militari *, were watching the Allied buildup in North Africa with terror. They, like Kesselring in the field, correctly assessed that the only logical, sustainable target for this massive amphibious force was Sicily. They saw no evidence of a Greek invasion and pleaded with the Germans to reinforce Italy. Mussolini, his regime now teetering, flew to meet Hitler at Klesheim Castle in April, desperately trying to convince his senior partner to send more panzers and aircraft to defend Italy. Hitler, who had already seen the preliminary mincemeat reports, treated him with disdain. He was patronizing, dismissing the Duce's valid fears as Italian pessimism and defeatist panic. Hitler knew better. He had the secret, stolen British documents. He believed he was the only one in the room, besides his German staff, who possessed this golden information. He told Mussolini, in effect, to stop worrying about Sicily and to be grateful that the Germans were preparing to meet the Times' real-time threat in the Balkans. It was the ultimate psychological victory. The lie was now being used to bully and dismiss the truth. Hitler's personal conviction was not a theoretical. It was immediately translated into ironclad military policy. He issued a series of Führer directives, the most potent orders in the German Reich, which reoriented the entire defense of the Mediterranean. On May 12th, even before the naval conference, he had formalized his belief. He ordered the Times, immediate Times, and Times massive Times, reinforcement of Greece and Sardinia. This was not a suggestion. It was a direct, unchallengeable command from the supreme leader. He ordered elite, battle-hardened units to move. The 1st Panzer Division was ordered from France to Greece, arriving in the Peloponnese to wait for an invasion that would never come. 2 additional Panzer Divisions were earmarked for the same theater. Elite Times, Panzer Grenadier, Times divisions were moved to Sardinia. Crucially, he ordered the transfer of torpedo boats, minesweepers, and Luftwaffe bomber wings from Sicily and southern Italy Times to the new, threatened areas. The lie was now dogma. It was official German military policy, set in stone by the one man whose word was absolute. Any German field commander in Sicily, like Kesselring, who looked out his binoculars and saw the gathering Allied armada, was now officially, according to the Führer's own intelligence, looking at a feint. His concerns were dismissed in Berlin as local thinking, lacking the big picture that Hitler had obtained from the man who never was. The Wehrmacht, in its legendary blind obedience, was now about to execute a series of massive, strategically fatal movements. all based on the fabricated life of a dead Welshman. Adolf Hitler's Führer directive, born from his unshakable faith in the Huelva documents, was not an order. And the German war machine, for all its internal fractures, was built to obey its Führer's orders with ruthless logistical efficiency. The success of Operation Mincemeat is not, therefore, found in the spy story alone. It is found in the numbers. It is written in the railway timetables, the naval grid coordinates, and the fuel consumption logs of the Wehrmacht. This is the statistical hammer of the deception, the cold, quantifiable proof that Major Martin's lies had physically reshaped the entire German defense of southern Europe, moving tens of thousands of men, hundreds of tanks, and entire air fleets to fight a phantom army. The first and most immediate shift was at sea. Admiral Karl Dönitz, who just a few days earlier had been correctly assessing Sicily as a major target, was now forced to obey the Führer's new conviction. In the official transcripts of the May 14th Naval Conference, Dönitz, after listening to Hitler's certainty, dutifully realigns his strategy. According to the OKW's own naval situation reports, a massive redeployment of U-boat wolfpacks was ordered. Submarines that had been concentrating in the shipping lanes west of Sicily and in the North Atlantic were ordered to make the dangerous passage through the Straits of Gibraltar and proceed at flank speed times east times toward the Aegean Sea. They were sent to hunt the Greek invasion fleet. Just as critically, Admiral Dönitz ordered a significant transfer of surface assets. Squadrons of E-boats, Schnellboot, the fast, deadly torpedo boats that were the primary defense against an amphibious night landing, were moved from their bases in Sicily and southern Italy and sent to patrol the Greek islands. Mine layers were dispatched to sow new defensive minefields in the Dardanelles and the approaches to Kalamata. In the space of 2 weeks, the naval defenses of the Sicilian Narrows, the most logical invasion point in the entire Mediterranean, were deliberately and catastrophically weakened. The air war followed the same fatal logic. Field Marshal Kesselring's greatest asset in defending Sicily was the Luftwaffe. The island's airfields were crowded with fighters and bombers, perfectly positioned to shatter any amphibious landing before it reached the shore. But Major Martin's letters had identified Sardinia and Greece. Hitler's directive, therefore, ordered this vital air cover to be stripped and sent elsewhere. Luftwaffe operational records from the period show a staggering transfer of air power. 2 entire times, Geschwader times, wings of fighters, primarily Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds, were ordered to fly from their bases in Sicily and southern Italy to new hastily prepared airfields in Sardinia. Simultaneously, squadrons of Junkers Ju-88 bombers were redeployed to air bases in Greece, ready to bomb the brimstone landing beaches. This move was a gift of incalculable value to the Allies. It handed air supremacy to the Allied air forces under General Eisenhower before a single boot had touched the sand. Allied reconnaissance flights in late May and June reported a shocking and welcome development. The skies over Sicily were suddenly, almost inexplicably, clearer. The hornet's nest had been voluntarily, and inexplicably, relocated. But the most devastating and logistically costly impact was on the ground. Hitler's core fear was for the Balkans, a region he was obsessed with. His directive set in motion the movement of his most elite and powerful ground forces. The first, and most significant, was the 1st Panzer Division. This was a veteran, elite armored force, fresh from refitting in France. Its original orders had it earmarked as a mobile reserve, for either times France or Sicily. Hitler's new order was explicit. It was to be sent, immediately, to Greece. The German railway, the Reichsbahn, was thrown into high gear. Hundreds of trains were required to move the division's tanks, half-tracks, artillery, and 16,000 men. We can trace this in the rail logs, a massive logistical effort, consuming thousands of tons of coal and fuel, all to move a premier armored division to the Peloponnese, where it began to practice defensive maneuvers on the beaches near Kalamata, waiting for an enemy that would never arrive. At the same time, the elite 90th Panzer Grenadier Division, a battle-hardened force that had been reconstituted from the ashes of the Afrika Korps, was ordered to Sardinia to defend against Operation Führer. Tens of thousands of the Wehrmacht's best, most experienced troops were now digging in on the wrong islands, hundreds of miles from the real battlefield. The trap was now set. The Wehrmacht, in a monumental feat of logistical obedience, was now perfectly positioned to defend the wrong war. The deception was total. The defenders remaining in Sicily, like Kesselring, still had significant forces, but they had been stripped of their elite armor, their dedicated naval support, and most critically, their air cover. Ewen Montagu's pocket litter and Archibald Nye's forged letter had, in the space of 6 weeks, achieved what months of bombing could not. They had surgically created the soft underbelly that Churchill had dreamed of. The real Operation Husky was about to begin, and its enemy was staring in the wrong direction. In the moonless, pre-dawn darkness of July 9–10, 1943, the sea south of Sicily erupted. This was Operation Husky, and it was, to that date, the largest and most complex amphibious operation in the history of warfare. It dwarfed all previous landings in its sheer, overwhelming scale. More than 160,000 men of the American 7th Army and the British 8th Army, carried by an armada of over 3,000 ships, landing craft, and gliders, were heading for the beaches of southeastern Sicily. This was the material reality. This was the statistical hammer of the Allies, an industrial, logistical, and human tidal wave poised to crash on what Churchill had called the soft underbelly. But the Wehrmacht, thanks to the man who never was not looking at this reality. They were hundreds of miles away, their best units staring at the coast of Greece, their U-boats patrolling the wrong sea, and their fighter wings waiting on the wrong island. The first 48 hours of the invasion were a case study in profound, self-inflicted confusion for the German High Command. When the first reports of massive parachute drops from the U.S. 82nd and British 1st Airborne Divisions and coastal landings reached the Wolf's Lair, the reaction was not panic, but satisfaction. This was exactly what the Major Martin documents had predicted. This, Berlin concluded, was the feint, the cover story for the real invasion of Greece. Field Marshal Kesselring, on the ground in Sicily, reported the landings as a major assault. But his reports were filtered through the lens of mincemeat in Berlin. The OKW's own situation report for July 10th dismissed the landings as a diversionary feint. Hitler, his conviction unshaken, refused to release the elite panzer divisions from Greece and Sardinia to help. He was convinced this was the prelude to the Times' real-time attack, Operation Brimstone. The deception was holding, even as the invasion was succeeding. The Wehrmacht's entire command structure was, for a critical 48-hour window, actively arguing times against times the reality its own frontline troops were reporting. From the Allied perspective, the initial phase of the landing was one of tense, almost unbelieving, success. Planners had braced for a bloodbath. They had expected the Luftwaffe, in particular, to wreak havoc on the packed landing beaches, just as it had done in Crete and at Dieppe. They expected German panzer divisions held in reserve to storm the beaches in a devastating counterattack, but the skies were, in comparison, almost quiet. General George S. Patton, commanding the American forces, noted in his diary the shocking lack of air opposition. General Bernard Montgomery, leading the British 8th Army, was able to establish his beachhead with a speed that his own planners had deemed wildly optimistic. This was the mincemeat dividend, paid in real time. The deadly Ju-88 bombers that should have been cratering the beaches were sitting on airfields in Greece. The Bf-109 fighters that should have been strafing the landing craft were patiently waiting in Sardinia. The Allies had achieved not just tactical, but psychological air supremacy before the first boot had touched the sand. It took a full 2 days, 48 agonizing hours, for the German High Command to finally, sickeningly, realize the truth. By July 12th, the Allies had secured their beachheads, landed over 150,000 men, and were already pushing inland. The scale of the feint was so vast, so overwhelming, that it could no longer be interpreted as anything but the main invasion. The truth hit Berlin with the force of a physical blow. The Major Martin documents were a lie. They had been, from beginning to end, spectacularly, completely, and totally fooled. The order was now given, in a state of absolute panic, to reverse the Wehrmacht's movements. This was the statistical hammer in reverse. Orders were screamed from Berlin to Greece. The 1st Panzer Division was to immediately turn around and redeploy to Sicily. From Sardinia, the 90th Panzer Grenadier Division was ordered to move at once, but it was impossible. The lie had introduced a fatal, irreversible time lag. A Panzer Division cannot be teleported. It is a logistical entity of 16,000 men, hundreds of tanks, and thousands of tons of fuel and ammunition. It had taken weeks to move them to the wrong islands via rail and ship. The Allies now controlled the skies and the seas. The Wehrmacht's frantic, desperate scramble was useless. The troops in Sardinia were trapped there. The 1st Panzer Division in Greece, after a chaotic attempt to move, was ultimately bogged down, too far away to matter. The soft underbelly had been proven real. The battle for Sicily was over in 38 days. While the fighting was bitter, particularly against the Hermann Göring Division, which was already on the island, the campaign was a stunning success. Allied casualties, while high, were a fraction of what planners had projected for an assault on a fully defended fortress. Mussolini was deposed, and the fascist regime in Italy collapsed. This victory, the first step into Hitler's Fortress Europe, was a direct, measurable result of Operation Mincemeat. The soft underbelly was real, not because it was inherently soft, but because Ewen Montagu and a dead Welsh drifter had surgically convinced the enemy to guard the wrong part of the body. The lie had become a tangible, strategic, and battle-winning reality. The fall of Sicily was shockingly swift. The entire campaign, which Allied planners had feared would be a months-long, grinding battle of attrition, was over in just 38 days. On the 17th of August 1943, the last Axis troops evacuated the island, and the Allies were in full control. The strategic consequences were immediate and seismic. On July 25th, mere weeks after the invasion began, Benito Mussolini was deposed and arrested. The Italian fascist regime, Hitler's first and most important ally, had crumbled. The Allies had their foothold in Fortress Europe, and the soft underbelly was now a bleeding wound. Back in London, in the cramped offices of the 20 Committee, the relief was ecstatic. The deception had not just worked, it had exceeded their wildest, most optimistic projections. Conversely, in the Wolf's Lair, the mood was one of apoplectic fury and humiliation. The German High Command, the OKW, immediately launched a bitter internal investigation. They were not, however, looking for the flawed logic that led them to believe a lie. They were looking for the traitor in Berlin who must have leaked the mincemeat documents to the British, who then cleverly switched their plans to Sicily. They were so thoroughly fooled that they believed the lie was the truth, and the truth was the deception. This was the ultimate proof of the thesis. Operation Mincemeat succeeded not just because it was a clever lie, but because, as we stated in the beginning, it was a lie that exploited the enemy's deepest, most ingrained assumptions. It did not just fool the German High Command, it flattered them. The Major Martin documents made them feel intelligent. It confirmed their pre-existing bias that the British were cunning and would not possibly be so oafish as to attack the most obvious target. It allowed them to discover a deeper secret, Greece, and see through the obvious feint, Sicily. Hitler, in particular, was a victim of his own ego, which the lie was custom-built to exploit. He distrusted his generals but trusted his intuition, and mincemeat felt like a secret intelligence coup that confirmed his own brilliance. The operation was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, a jiu-jitsu move that used the enemy's own intellectual arrogance and bureaucratic structure against them, turning their strengths into the very weaknesses that sealed their defeat in Sicily. But what of the man at the center of it all? The body of Major William Martin was not recovered by the British. After the Germans had photographed the documents, the Spanish returned the body, along with the briefcase, to the British Vice Consul, Francis Haselden. On the 2nd of June 1943, Major Martin was given a full military burial in the Cementerio de la Soledad in Huelva. His casket, draped in the Union Jack, was carried by Spanish soldiers. The funeral was attended by Haseldin and other local dignitaries, another part of the performance to convince any watching German agents of his authenticity. He was interred under a standard Commonwealth War Graves Commission headstone, which read simply, William Martin, DSO, Major, Royal Marines. 24th March 1907, 30th April 1943. For decades, his true identity remained one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. Ewen Montagu and his team, though proud of their work, were bound by the Official Secrets Act, and more, by a promise to Bentley Purchase that the man's identity would be protected and his service, though anonymous, would be honored. The story, however, was too good to remain secret forever. In 1953, with the war a recent memory, Ewen Montagu was given permission to publish a heavily sanitized version of the story. His book, *The Man Who Never Was*, became an international bestseller and, in 1956, a successful film. The world learned the story of Major Martin, but his true name was still withheld. The secret of Glyndwr Michael held for another 40 years. It was not until 1996 that an amateur Welsh historian named Roger Morgan, meticulously tracing local records, finally uncovered the truth and identified the link between the mincemeat body and the death of the homeless drifter in Street Pancras. Faced with the undeniable evidence, the British government finally confirmed the story. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission, in a final act of respect and recognition, amended the headstone in Huelva. It now bears an additional poignant inscription. The grave in Spain, now a site of pilgrimage, carries the truth. The inscription reads, Glyndwr Michael, served as Major William Martin, R.M. It is the perfect, paradoxical epitaph. Glyndwr Michael, a man whose life was so invisible as to be non-existent to the state, a man who died a tragic, lonely, and anonymous death, was, in that death, given a new, fabricated life. And in that fictitious role, as a man who never was, he executed the single most decisive, tangible, and strategically brilliant act of deception of the Second World War. His fabricated identity saved tens of thousands of lives and fooled an entire regime by proving that, in warfare, the most powerful weapon is not always a tank or a battleship, but the assumptions of the enemy's mind,